I'm Miguel Badia with Zach Mann, and today we are speaking with Villanova alumna MK Smith. The purpose of this interview is to raise awareness and foster more dialogue and conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion at Villanova. So to start off, MK, can you please tell us a bit about yourself and describe your experience with activism at Villanova?
Sure. So first, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. My name is MK Smith. I'm a recent graduate of Villanova, class of 2019. I've been out in the working world for a year now. I'm also a graduate student at Georgetown University. And I, in terms of like what I do now, I work in Middle East politics. And I can talk more about that later in the way it relates back to activism. But in terms of my initiation into activism, I entered Villanova as many, if not most, it involved being in the same clubs that we can all think of off the top of our head. And that was me, freshman year. I filled that role, and I think I did it well. But then sophomore year came a turn in which the 2016 election happened in November of my sophomore year. And that was a turning point for many Villanovans. On one side, I would say people were all of a sudden more interested in, wow, how did we reach this moment? Because for many people, it felt like a turning point in American society and politics. And I would say that, on the other hand, people were also emboldened. There are folks on that campus who fly Trump Pence flags. There are people who don't believe that certain students should be on campus. And those people, I feel comfortable saying, felt like they could speak out. It was pretty clear within the first couple days after the election. And there was some violence on campus that one student perpetrated against another. And that was kind of the catalyst for a group of us to be like, something has got to give. So this initiative was absolutely led by women of color. And they organized a vigil for Unitas in which it was intersectional, interfaith, and folks got up and we read narratives that had been submitted by students who were like, this is a terrible, horrible act of violence that's been committed on our campus, but it's doing everyone a disservice to say that it's an isolated incident. We, went through some of these narratives, and that was kind of the beginning of formation for a group of us. And I owe all of my education in that time to the particularly women of color who were happy to show me the ropes and, kind of really, I would say, raise me in a different way. And that activism then led to a group of us pushing for reform at the institutional level. And that involved meeting with different administrators and faculty members and student groups and student government and things like that that I can talk about a little bit later, but that's pretty much the beginning.
Awesome. Thank you very much for sharing. It's really interesting just hearing how Villanova changed in light of the 2016 election, which neither myself nor Miguel were around for. Mm-hmm. It really sounds like you sort of became an ally immediately following that. So our next question would just be, like, in your own words, what does allyship mean to you?
So a couple things. One, I appreciate that you're asking about allyship rather than being an ally, because I think the latter kind of has a stagnant feeling to it. It's like, once you've got it, you've got it. And that's not the case. And allyship, it's a tricky question in that it's not for me to decide because I'm not a minoritized person. So it's not my place to say, well, I'm doing X, Y, Z, and that's what's wanted, because I don't always know. Often I don't. It takes listening and learning. So in my opinion, allyship is listening, it's showing up, and it's doing what's asked of you. Yes, there are moments where, I am in a space in my white identity. I recognize that I can leverage that and take a particular stance and maybe try and spearhead a certain conversation. But more often than not, that's not my place. My place is to do what's asked of me in order to support different communities. And I think that the biggest, and I apologize, this isn't exactly your question, but the biggest confusion with Villanova, as well as in a larger American society, is
we conflate the idea of allyship with help. And those are not the same thing. Help is showing up for something that isn't your problem, to put it in harsh words. And that's not what allyship is. So you have to take it out of this context of one group helping another and put it into a larger context of liberation. So I'm talking racial, sexual, economic liberation. What does that mean for us to all live in a free society? That means every single one of us has something to benefit from living in a liberated world. Every person does. And so that's a collective goal. So we have to work collectively towards it. It's not, oh, you know, I'm here to help you with your struggle. No, our struggles are interlinked. And right now, the struggle that absolutely needs the attention is rooted in racial oppression and the need for racial liberation. So yeah.
That's an interesting distinction that you make there between allyship and just individual acts of like helping people. I think that's an important distinction to make. And also, I found it interesting how you mentioned the 2016 election as a turning point, because I can't help but kind of see the recent events and even the 2020 election as another kind of turning point at Villanova. And I've seen a lot more people being kind of emboldened and like being kind of inspired to take more action recently. So following that, what is your advice to Villanovans who want to become better allies and become more involved with activism on campus?
So first of all, I've heard a lot of discussion, at least from, you know, my outside alumni perspective, of new organizations being established and things like that. I've especially heard it from members of the white community, which I think is really interesting. The way that I have been able to conceptualize this is the Black Lives Matter movement has for years, and, you know, they echoed this more upon the murder of George Floyd. The things that they're asking for are the defunding of the police, among other things. No one from the Black Lives Matter movement asked for a street to be painted to say Black Lives Matter. But people were like, oh, this is the right thing, we're gonna do that. That's a prime example of performative allyship, of thinking that an aesthetic change is enough. And so I use that as an example because I think that people at Villanova are like, oh, what can we do? What can we think of like to help with this? There are institutions already in place that have been working towards liberation on Villanova's campus. All you have to do is listen to Black Student Union. There are already diversity organizations involved. Multicultural Greek is heavily involved in issues of social justice. Campus ministry is actually really involved in this conversation. So I'm not saying don't start something new, but I'm saying listen to the people who have been saying and shouting and begging for people to care, and lend them your time. And by lend, I mean as an ally, not as help, because otherwise you're centering yourself in that narrative, right? Otherwise it's like, well, what can I do? Yes, your allyship is great, but it's not about you. So listen to what's needed and act accordingly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a really important distinction to make, and I think that's a very good point to say that we should be building off of what's already there and what's already been established, and not necessarily going through a whole new process of starting something over and anew. So you talked about on campus and off campus, a couple organizations that are involved in activism. And how does like the activism that you might see on Villanova's campus translate into the real world now that you're a graduate? And what sort of insights have you gained since you graduated?
Sure. So my first year and a half at Villanova prior to the election, it was very much like common knowledge that Villanova was apolitical, which is false. It's not apolitical. People were just quiet about their politics. And so, but then upon the 2016 election, people became emboldened, whether that be on whatever side. And that for me was a prime example of how you don't, like when someone is telling you who they are, listen, right? So it had me thinking back to oh, this person who I now know feels a particular way about the presence of LGBTQ or queer people on Villanova's campus. I heard them make a remark 6 months ago, and I called them out and I was like, hey, that's wrong. And they said, oh, it's a joke. That was them telling me who they are and what they value. But I didn't take it at face value for that. So for me, as I entered into the professional space, I came to realize that as well. Right after I graduated, I was working in the national security sector. Where I quickly gathered did not align with my politics. And there's basically two camps. The camp that says, the personal and political, you need to separate those. You need a job. And I hear that. You need a job. You need to make money because we do live in a capitalist society. On the other hand, I fall into the camp that believes that your professional ethics should reflect your personal ones. And so for me, I quickly made a transition in my career path. And I was fortunate because that opportunity was available to me. So I would say that activism at Villanova definitely gave me an idea of my own morals. Not that I didn't have morals before, but they certainly formed them, and my ability to articulate them and my ability to make them actionable. Otherwise, I'm not entirely sure how I would have translated how I care about one thing in one space to caring about it in another. I'm not sure that would have translated in the same way. And then the other, probably most crucial lesson that I carried is there's this concept of Villanova niceness. I don't know if that term is still thrown around on campus. Okay. Villanova niceness, it's like the politeness. It's like, I'm gonna hold the door open for you, and then I'm gonna say a bunch of racist crap about you as soon as the door closes. But I held the door open, so it's okay. That very much exists everywhere when you leave campus. So that idea of politeness and how to navigate it too, even in conversations with administrators. They are your administrators and you are a student, and they do hold power over your academic career. That rings true as well when you're navigating your career path, of how to navigate that politeness and knowing how to navigate it and be able to say, okay, what you're saying it with a really nice tone, but what you're saying isn't nice. What you're saying is racist, it's sexist, it's homophobic. So learning how to approach that in a way that's effective, that maybe makes people a little bit less defensive right off the bat, that was a really important skill.
All right, so kind of shifting the discussion a little bit. As a Villanova alumni, what are your thoughts regarding the university's response to the murder of George Floyd and the nationwide protests? And do you feel that the administration responded appropriately, or do you think that there are more actions or different actions that they need to take?
So there's different elements of the administration, right? Dr. Nance is part of the administration. Dr. Nance is, in my book, an angel on earth. So she's part of the administration, but she's doing everything in her power to infiltrate that space and to make sustainable room for conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, etc. There are faculty members who have been working on this for a long time, things like that. That said, the administration in the ivory tower sense, the way we think about it, not just Father Peter, but anyone who falls in that immediate decision-making space. No, I don't think that their response was adequate. I still get the emails. The alumni still get the emails, right? And those emails, the last one that came out, the things that they're talking about, like, oh, we'll look into XYZ, a diversity requirement, whatever. Those things I'm sure existed before I was on campus, but even when I was on campus, by the time I was a sophomore, those were demands that were being made. I've witnessed it. I've seen it happen. Administrators listen to it. They say they're going to work on it. Nothing happens. So why did it take a video of a man being murdered for 9 minutes for the administration to say, okay, now we're actually going to do something about it? Why was the entry point for them caring watching someone be murdered? Why was it that pain? Why was the pain and lived experiences of students of color not enough? Because they had been told, those narratives had been shared, but it wasn't until this was a national conversation, it wasn't until there was an Instagram account that has been led by Black Villanovans sharing their experience, mind you, in a public space where other university students and other university administrators can see what's being said about Villanova. Why is it not until this was public discourse that any sort of tangible change was being made? So I don't think the response was adequate, but of course, that's ultimately just my opinion. I can't speak for folks who are working on those issues right now, but no, I do not think it was adequate. If an adequate response would be listening the first time, and it would be actually presenting tangible change. I understand that the university is political, I get that. But a lot of those things where we'll look into, we'll try, none of it felt tangible to me. So we'll see, maybe I'll be proven wrong, but right now I don't trust it.
Okay, good perspective on how that before our time there was talk of doing all of the things that has been brought up recently, but it hasn't been basically until a nationwide catalyst and public spotlight has been put on universities and other organizations that there's been any talk of concrete action. Do you feel as if there is anything concrete that Villanova can do in this moment to help with the anti-racism effort?
Absolutely. I mean, all of those demands that were put in place by the Black Student Union, but I believe it was a collective of different Black student organizations and Black leaders on campus who put together, it was a letter that I think came out earlier in the week. Everything on that list, that's a tangible change. That's something the university can absolutely do. Defunding Villanova PD, that's within the university's power because Villanova PD doesn't serve the outside community. It's Villanova's police department. They manage the funds allocated to it, etc. That's one thing. Number two, I think that we need to think critically about the role that legacy admissions play at Villanova. We really tout the fact that we have a large legacy constituency. And from an admissions standpoint, as someone who used to work in admissions in Blue Key, I understand that that's nice because it's like, you know, people love it here so much that their kids then love it here so much. And I get that, that's great. But when the majority of the folks leaving Villanova, graduating Villanova are white, the majority of legacy students are also going to be white. So I think that that is a system that needs to be looked into, definitely. Along with other things, I mean, again, Black Student Union put together an excellent list, things like a physical space for Black, Indigenous people of color on campus would be fantastic. Having diversity training, that's been a request for years, just a basic diversity training for different faculty members. That would be crucial as well.
So kind of moving on, a program that a lot of students speak very highly of is the Intergroup Relations program at Villanova. So have you ever taken IGR before at Villanova? And if so, what was your experience with it? And what are the benefits of taking it?
So I took 3 IGRs during my time at Villanova. I was in sexual orientation, race, and then advanced race. Advanced race is a long weekend course that you take after having taken race. They're such crucial classes, I believe, especially for white people to be taking. I think that it's absolutely critical. So I think one of the myths is that like you take IGR and you're no longer racist, you're no longer transphobic. That's not the case, but it is a starting point. So for me, I even recall, I can't recall exactly what the example was, but I remember leaving race IGR and feeling like I had a really good grasp of my own racism, you know, where I still needed to do work, things like that. And I feel like I knew those zones of racism that I needed to work on. Then I got into advanced race, and it wasn't even 2 months later that I was taking that. And one of the facilitators pointed something out to me and basically called me in on something that I had said. And I was like, oh my God, I never even thought of that. So here I was, someone who was allegedly, you know, proficient in her understanding of her own racism, that she was now in advanced race. and I was still learning new things. So IGR isn't an end-all be-all. It is a great starting point for a lot of people. If nothing else, it forces you to be able to talk about your feelings and your beliefs in a way that is communicable. So even if what you are saying is awful, at least you are in a setting in which people are able to engage and call each other in, instead of this defensiveness that often causes us to just kind of shut down. Alternatively, it makes space and it demands that people engage and unpack and work on problematic things that arise.
I know you said it's a really important course for particularly white Villanovans to take. And essentially, speaking of white Villanovans, do you think that Villanova's demographics affect the school's ability to be an inclusive environment for marginalized groups? And do you think it also affects their ability to act on social issues? And if so, maybe why?
Absolutely. The demographics of the university absolutely play a role in the university's ability for multiple reasons. Number one, when you're working on diversity, equity, and inclusion work on a PWI or predominantly white institution like Villanova, it is more often than not the minority of people who are going to the administration and saying, this is a problem, okay? So what is the incentive? Again, it's terrible that we have to think about the academy in these political economic frameworks, but what is the benefit to the university to listen if you're going to graduate in 3 years or 4 years or 2 or 1? Why listen when you're the minority and you're not loud enough in their opinion for change to be made? So yes, having a larger constituency of Black, Indigenous people of color is absolutely essential. And also, I think that something that so during my time at Villanova, the conception was that as long as you weren't a part of, actually, there weren't even any particular organizations, maybe in the eyes of a few people, so long as you weren't a part of XYZ club, you weren't racist. You weren't upholding white supremacy, it's just fine. The fact of the matter is, pretty much every institution on Villanova's campus, with exceptions, obviously, is upholding white supremacy on that campus. If you're involved in Pan-Hellenic Greek life, you're upholding it. If you're involved in not Special Olympics as a higher institution, but Special Olympics of Villanova and part of committee, you're a part of upholding white supremacy. If you're a part of orientation, you're absolutely upholding white supremacy. And the reason that I say this is because people have this idea that diversity, equity, and inclusion just means having a Black person in the room or just having a Latinx person in the room. That's absolutely, in my opinion, not the case. So rhetoric that I've heard repeatedly, and I apologize because I'm straying a little bit from the question, but I promise I'll circle back. I've had multiple experiences in which people from orientation or SPO or Blue Key or whatever say, well, okay, yeah, it's predominantly white, but what should we do? Do you want us to take a less qualified Black person over a white person? Which is, hold up, number one, who said that the Black person is less qualified? Who said that? Second of all, if you only have 3 Black people applying for this position, it's not because Black people on Villanova's campus don't care about Special Olympics. No way, that's absolutely not the case. It's what kind of community are you creating once people of color all are involved in that organization? Is it a community that they actually feel that they are a part of? Because more often than not, the answer might be no. And then what incentive would you give? I think the prime example of this is diversity skit and how we see it at orientation. The largest constituency of people of color during orientation weekend, students interact with in diversity skit. In diversity skit, I say this as someone who has participated in diversity skit, is absolutely necessary. It does crucial work. But what does it say when you have all these new students, most of whom are white, are having fun, playing games with their counselors, or orientation counselors, who also are most likely white. But then the one somber activity you have that weekend that you have to take seriously is going into a room hearing about hardships from Black students, from students of color, what does that mean? What does that mean for someone if that's your only interaction with someone of color? And why is it that so many students with minoritized identities think that their labor is better served operating within the framework of diversity skit than applying for orientation, right? Because you can't do both. You can't be an OC and do skit at the same time. So why is there this divide? Maybe it's community rooted. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. But yes, I'm sorry, that was tangential, but worth saying, I think.
So to ask kind of like a follow-up, I think you kind of made a point that the university has a lower motivation to change because students graduate in a short amount of time. So what about after students graduate? What kind of like pushback have you seen from the alumni community to the school?
That is a great question. Admittedly, I'm not super involved in the Alumni Association in DC, where I live. I've been to 2 events, almost exclusively white. And it was very young. It was almost all recent graduates. And so I can't attest to that so much, like what's the alumni pushback, but what I can say is the power that alumni have. So again, a university is a business, and it needs funding. And a lot of that funding, if not all of it, you can direct where your funding goes. You can say, here's my $200 donation. It can only go to the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Or people give it more generally, or people give it to Greek life, whatever it may be. So I think alumni need to recognize the power that they have, not just monetarily speaking, but alumni are walking representatives of the university anywhere that they go. So I mean, I've been asked by folks who have said, colleagues or whatever, who have said, oh, my child is thinking of going to Villanova. What's it like? I'm going to give an honest answer. So that's a power that I have as an alumni that doesn't depend upon my financial availability and things like that.
All right. So thinking kind of like big picture now, what are some steps that the university community, including students, organization, faculty, or even alumni, what can we do to ensure a more inclusive campus?
Listen would be my number one. I won't provide you with examples of what we should be doing, because those have been, as I said earlier, those have been provided by students who have explicitly stated what they need. And it's not a want, it's a need. To feel like you can survive and thrive on Villanova's campus, there are things that every student needs, no matter what different identities you hold. Everyone needs to feel safe. As a white student on Villanova's campus, I feel safe. As a woman on Villanova's campus, not so much. But as a white person, yes, I feel safe. Everyone wants to feel a part of a community. Again, as a white person, I do. I come on campus, first day of orientation, my counselor looks just like me. Almost everyone in my orientation group looks just like me. I feel like I belong. And everyone wants to feel like they're valued, right? And so when I can join the things that I am told are the most valuable parts of Villanova is a status-based campus. I mean, in many ways, it can be like high school, right? Where it's like, if you're a part of the core 4 or whatever, then you've made it. If you're a nationer, then you've made it. And if I feel I have access to those things that the university obviously values because they tout those things in those clubs and organizations and the work that they do, then yeah, I feel valued. I feel like I'm a critical member of Villanova's community. But if the labor that I am always investing in the university isn't even listened to, if your experiences are dismissed, if the things that you are explicitly saying, I need XYZ, if people aren't even listening and then come up 3 years later and say, oh, here are things that need to be done, and pretending like you never said anything in the first place, that's erasure. I mean, that's layers upon layers of dehumanization. And so people need to listen. They need to listen. That would be my number one thing. Listen to different minoritized groups on Villanova's campus. When a student tells you that they don't feel comfortable at orientation, ask why. Don't just say, oh, that's too bad. When a student tells you that they're facing microaggressions from their professor, ask why and how you can help. And excuse me, I don't mean help. I mean, how can you be an ally? Can you go with them to report the professor? Can you assist in filling out the ethics point form or whatever? Yeah.
I think that your answer just now gave a really clear idea of how Villanova may not be the most accommodating place to minority groups. So I would like to take a moment to, if you could you possibly clarify the link between some parts of your previous answer and a thing you said, I think a couple minutes back, where you're mentioning how Greek organizations, or specifically Villanova Special Olympics, could be seen as enabling white supremacy? Because I know a lot of people will hear that and they'll be instantly upset. So if there's anything you could do to clarify that, I think people would really appreciate it, because I don't want you to be heard the wrong way.
Of course. Thank you for asking the follow-up question. So at least the way that I was taught white supremacy as like a middle schooler, or whenever it's first introduced, which, number one, I didn't have to learn about white supremacy until I was a middle schooler, because I never experienced it. I just got to learn about it. We think that it's people in hoods, right? It's the KKK, it's burning crosses, it's segregated water fountains. White supremacy is the upholding of it's the maintenance of a society in which white people have more privilege, in my understanding. So when I say, I'll start with the one that is a little bit easier to explain, that Greek life upholds white supremacy. The Instagram account, I think it's called Black at Villanova, there were numerous stories on there about Black women, just trying to do what a lot of us women would do on a Friday night and try and go to a frat party, and being turned away because they don't belong there. So that for me is a key example. Why, number one, why is that? Number two, I don't know what goes on in a fraternity or a sorority, for that matter. I don't know what happens behind closed doors. I don't know. Why is it that we have multicultural Greek and we have Pan-Hellenic Greek? Of course, I understand the historical roots of multicultural Greek, and that's fantastic, but the two don't collaborate, if we're being honest. Greek Week, until I believe my senior year, Greek Week was Pan-Hellenic, and then you had different weeks for different multicultural Greek organizations. So there's not that inclusion of what's going on. Number two, a lot of these fraternities and sororities, as far as I understand, and I welcome being corrected on this because I don't know for a fact, I believe many of them have existed on schools that have been historically white exclusively, and they still exist. Again, you're running into legacy programs when you're talking about these fraternities and sororities. So that's my answer for that one. With regards to Special Olympics, I say this as someone who was on committee for 2 years before I stepped down. Yes, there are people of color on committee. Few of them, but there are. I say that it upholds white supremacy in that it upholds a white savior complex. And again, it's all tied into who's being admitted into the university. But if you have Philadelphia County coming for Special Olympics, and that's one of the counties that comes, that is predominantly Black, and you have 2 Black LPHs, and the other 68 or whatever are all white, what is that? When an LPH is your host, when many LPHs take it upon themselves to act as a sort of mentor, whether or not they're supposed to, that's very messed up, in my opinion. And again, I've had this conversation with different members of the committee. I faced the critique before that, how can you say it upholds XYZ? How can you say it's a gatekeeper for racism when there's just not that many Black people applying? Okay, did you go to the Black Student Union meeting and say, hi, we're from Special Olympics and we would like you to apply? Because you went to the Blue Key meeting and you went to orientation and you went to all these different organizations, and your members are a part of all these predominantly white organizations and they're spreading the word. But if you have one Black person on committee and you're like, oh, okay, they'll tell the Black people, absolutely not. So are you creating an environment that's inclusive of and encouraging for students of color to be applying to those organizations in the first place? So I think that when because people, as you said, will get defensive when they hear that. I understand that. It's not about you. Why are you getting defensive? Why not listen to the critique? And as you did, ask a follow-up question. Because it's not about you. It's not about the particular organization. It's about the larger idea of what kind of campus environment are you establishing.
For our final question, just kind of in general, do you have any sort of final message that you would like to get out to the Villanova community? Or in other words, is there anything that the students, faculty, administration need to hear right now?
I will speak to the white people in the audience. Yes, it is great that people are engaged right now, or at least to an extent. But I'll echo a question I asked earlier, which is, why did it take till now to care? Why? I mean, if you're saying I didn't know, why didn't you know? Who aren't you talking to? Who aren't you listening to that you have the privilege of not knowing until right now? And just think critically about that. It's worth considering. I would encourage everyone to seriously reflect on the organizations that they participate in and the role that they play in them. I'm not saying, oh, you're in this organization, quit it right now, because I said earlier that it upholds certain systems and white supremacy. If you think that's the right avenue, yeah, quit, that's fine. But there's power in infiltrating spaces and trying to make change from where you're at. So if you can, do it, try to do it. Like I said, our liberation is collective. You're not speaking out of the kindness of your heart. You standing up is, you're serving yourself just as much as you're serving the person standing next to you when you fight for a more equitable and just society. And I understand, actually I don't understand, sorry, I always say that, I understand. I don't understand this fatigue that I'm hearing from people of, all that we're hearing about during quarantine is race and racism, right? Okay, that's just because, number one, you probably haven't had a conversation about race before right now. So now the fact that there's, 2 months of conversations where people are relatively engaged, you are exhausted by it. To me, that's like how, there's this really common analogy that I've heard and helped me grasp the Black Lives Matter movement when I was first trying to ground myself in my understanding of it, which is that the Black Lives Matter movement is like, if a house is on fire in a neighborhood and the fire department shows up and you run out of your house and say, wait, all houses matter. So you need to put water in my house too, even though your house is not on fire. No, the water goes on the house that's on fire right now, right? When I hear people talking about how they're tired of this conversation, that to me is like, not only are you asking for the water on your house, but you're complaining about how the ashes of the other one make your neighborhood less aesthetically pleasing. You're complaining that the ashes are dirty and you don't like the way it looks. So if you're tired of the conversation, imagine how tired people are who have been living through racism for 18, 19, 20 years, which many of your peers have. They have been experiencing. So, think beyond yourself and think critically about the institutions you're involved in, the role you play in them, the role they play in the Villanova community, and who is the community for? Because right now, it's not for everyone. It's for a very particular kind of person.
All right. Well, thank you so much, MK, for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us. We hope that this interview will help open up more dialogue about racism and other social issues on campus. I'm Miguel Badia with Zach Mann, and this is MK Smith. Thank you for listening.
Thanks.